Good evening. Sorry for the slight delay. We were waiting for one of our panelists to arrive. It seems he's got caught somewhere. We have not been able to get hold of him. He will join the panel as and when he arrives. Right Honorable Dr. Ramanandi Yadav, distinguished members of the panel, and ladies and gentlemen in the audience. Good evening. I am Deepak Thapa from Social Science Baha. I would like to thank you all for being here with us today as we celebrate Richard Burghart and his contribution to Nepal studies. It gives me and Social Science Baha great pleasure to be able to present his book, The History of Janakpurdham, a study of asceticism and the Hindu Polity in this setting. It is most apt that a native of Dhanusha should be the one doing the honors, and we're most thankful to Dr. Ramanandi Yadav for consenting to be with us on this occasion. I will not speak for long, since we have a whole list of speakers slated to speak after me. But what I will say is that despite his small published output, Richard Burghart is among the most cited scholars on Nepal. This is mainly due to his seminal article, The Formation of the Concept of Nation-State in Nepal. And even in this conference, his name has been bandied around. We hope that the history of Janakpurdham will introduce a different and fascinating aspect of his scholarship and be appreciated by both the social science community and the lay reader alike. With this, I would like to request Professor Nirmal Mantuladhar, who is the chairperson of Social Science Baha, but who earlier used to be the executive director of the Center for Nepal and Asian Studies, with which Richard Burghart himself was affiliated while doing his fieldwork in Nepal, when it was called the Institute for Nepal and Asian Studies. Professor Tuladhar will be delivering the welcome address.
Thank you, everybody. Good evening. Dr. Ramanandi Yadav, former President of Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal, Professor Michael Hart, Director of South Asia Institute, SOAS, Professor Ramanandi Yadav. Hopefully, he is on the way. He will join us later. And Mr. Jacob Wings of Yale University on dais, participant of the conference, former Nepalese ambassador, and His Excellency, and learned guest of Social Science Bar, and ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Social Science Baha, ANEHS, BNEAC, CNRS, and Nepal Academic Network, I am delighted and honored to welcome you all here to launch of this posthumous work entitled The History of Janakpurdham, a study of asceticism and Hindu polity by Richard Burghart. We are indeed most grateful to Dr. Ramanandi Yadav for gracefully consenting to be with us and to release this work. I feel that there cannot be any better dignitary than Dr. Ramanandi Yadav to launch this work on Nepal Tarai. At the same time, there cannot be any other better scholars of Asian and Nepali studies than Professor Michael Hart, Professor Ramanandi Yadav, and Jacob Wings, to talk about this groundbreaking work done by the late Richard Burghart, and edited and introduced by Professor Martin Gensler, who is equally a renowned scholar of Asian and Nepalese studies. This brief welcome address of mine will not be properly done if I don't express my sincere thanks to Dr. Ramanandi Yadav for being with us, and to Professor Michael Hart and Professor Ramanandi and Mr. Jacob Rins for willing to talk about this important work. I should not forget to appreciate the quality work of Social Science Bar and Himal Books in producing a fine hardbound book. And of course, the lauded audience you all here. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kuradar. The editor of the book, Professor Martin Gensley of the University of Vienna, could not be with us today, but has sent us a brief note to be read out on his behalf. And I now call upon Srishti Adhikari, one of my colleagues at Social Science Bar, to help me out on this.
Dear colleagues and friends, it has been a long time effort and much work to bring out this book, extending over more than 6 years, so I'm particularly delighted that it has finally seen the light of day. Unfortunately, I cannot attend this auspicious event in person. I'm presently in Warsaw at the European Conference of South Asian Studies of European Association of South Asian Studies, of which I am currently the president. But as Deepak Thapa invited me to give a short address, I'll take up this opportunity to say a few words on the background of the book project. After Richard Burghart's death on January the 1st, 1994, his wife Nadia Riceland soon left Heidelberg to take up a position at Aberdeen University, Scotland. While moving, she took all the research materials of her late husband along with her and eventually gave it, supported by Will Tulather Douglas, to the Sir Duncan Rice Library at the University of Aberdeen. However, a copy of his thesis had been left behind in Heidelberg, and when I asked Nadia what to do with it, she suggested to make use of it in some way which would contribute to the dissemination of Richard's work. Of course, the best way to do this is a book. So several years later, when Social Science Baha started making accessible important books on Nepal, I saw this as an opportunity to make Richard's heavy monograph on Janakpur available to the public. Fortunately, Deepak Thapa took up this idea, and it is thanks to his long and continuous support that this book finally materialized. I, above all, want to thank him and his team at Social Science Baha for their competent and diligent work. Now, I'm pleased to hold in my hands a book of 1.25 kg, heavy in weight and content, but altogether in a handy format with an appealing look. The thesis had been a 4 kg volume, much too bulky to use. As a printed book, so I hope, it will provide the public with a detailed ethnography and history of Janakpur, which will serve as a rich source for a critical look at the past. At the same time, it will give us a better understanding of Richard Burghart's anthropological work in general. But beyond this, I also hope that this book will be an inspiration to all who work in and on Nepal as ethnohistorians, that is, anthropologists with a historian interest and as historians with anthropological interest. Richard's approach shows us how important it is to delve deeply into the social, economic, and political history of a state in order to understand the present. And this is especially true of the Tarai region, where both history and anthropology have been lagging behind. So I hope this book will contribute to a renewed interest in a neglected research region and a methodology of ethnohistory which, due to the richness of written resources, is highly suitable to Nepal. I look forward to a critical and fruitful debate, something Richard would certainly have enjoyed. Thank you.
For those of you who may not have guessed, that is Martin in his office. We certainly will. We're recording the proceedings to be sent to him and to Nadia, Richard Burghart's wife, as a tribute to Richard himself. Richard Burghart earned his doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. We are fortunate to have with us Professor Michael Hutt, Director of the South Asia Institute at the same institution. I now invite Professor Hutt to say a few words about Richard Burghart.
Dr. Ram Baranyadav, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honour to say a few words about Richard Burghart and his contribution, and also a few words about my own interactions with him. Richard Burghart was born in 1944 in the United States of America. He studied for a BA Political Science at Williams College in Massachusetts, which he passed in 1966. In the course of his studies, he spent 9 months at University College in Ibadan in Nigeria. So he had an early interest in the non-Western world, and particularly Africa, which developed into a lifelong interest in Nepal and South Asia. He joined SOAS, my home university in London, in 1966 as an MPhil student, and completed his MPhil in 1969. He then went on to work for his PhD, during which he spent 26 months on fieldwork in Janakpurdham. And his thesis, which is the book we are today launching, was accepted for a PhD at SOAS in 1978. His supervisor was Professor Audrey Cantley, who herself sadly passed away last year in her 90s. Professor Burghart then took up a position at the London School of Economics in London in 1979, but did the sensible thing very quickly and moved back to SOAS the following year. He remained at SOAS until 1988, and then he moved to become the Professor of Anthropology and the head of the Department of Ethnology at the University of Heidelberg in 1988, where he remained until his tragic death in 1994, aged 49. He died, unfortunately, of a brain tumour. Between 1975 and 1991, he left us around 38 published articles, two of which were highly influential. Namely one entitled For a Sociology of India, an intracultural approach to the study of Hindu society, published in 1983, and Renunciation in the Religious Tradition of South Asia, published in Man in 1982. During his time in London, he also made a major contribution to what was then the new field of medical anthropology. Much of his most significant work, had not as yet been published before his death, and we know that there are at least two unfinished manuscripts that have never seen the light of day, including a project on spoken Nepali language in its social context. A volume of his published and unpublished essays appeared in 1996 under the title The Conditions of Listening, which is, I think, one of the absolutely key texts for people working on South Asia, and particularly people with a strong interest in Nepal. I myself studied for my PhD at SOAS from 1984 to 1988, so we were there for some time together, although I was a student. I was in the South Asia Languages and Cultures Department, and Richard was in the Anthropology Department, but I came to know him quite well from a distance. At a time when most foreign academics working on Nepal were ethnographers of hill communities, Richard Burghart stood out. First, he had acquired a mastery not so much of Nepali or of any language of the hills, but of Metali. Second, he proved that it was possible to use the insights gained from work in the Nepal Tarai to say profound things about the political history and contemporary political culture of Nepal, and about religion and society in South Asia more generally. So his perspective was a very different and distinct one, and a very important example to us all. He was of a retiring personality, and he would rarely speak out without careful deliberation. He was also capable of very deep reflection. I remember him calling me to his office one day to quiz me on my understanding of the word Nepalipan. I was simultaneously flattered to think that he felt he had anything to learn from me, and also slightly flawed by his questions, because they probed much more deeply than I'd ever done into the connotations and usages of a single word. Whenever Richard Burghart did speak, however, he often had something profound to say. I remember when I managed to persuade him to return to SOAS from Heidelberg after I took up a postdoc fellowship there in 1987. I was running a weekly Himalayan studies seminar. After we had had lunch together, he spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in a corner of the staff common room, writing very neat notes on a bunch of index cards. These provided the basis for his talk, and then for his chapter on the panchayat system in the book I edited later, entitled Nepal in the 90s. I still think this essay is one of the most incisive, perceptive essays ever written by a foreigner on the political culture of Nepal in any period. So we all miss Richard Burghart still. He would have been 72 now if he had not been so cruelly struck down in his prime. I believe he would have been delighted by these annual conferences. I think he would have been participating in them on a regular basis. He would also have been very proud, in his own modest way, to see his PhD thesis honoured and published at last. And I will end here by thanking everyone who had a hand in making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hutt. Up next was meant to be Professor Ramanandi. He still is not here. I hope nothing untoward has happened. Next in line is Jacob Rink. The self-effacing Jacob Rink is undoubtedly one of the most promising scholars of the new generation. Fortunately for us who were in the process of bringing out the book, he's also someone who works on Dhanusha, and he offered to graciously proofread the book as it was being sent to press, and also happened to be around to join the panel and to provide a latter-day critique of the book. Jacob.
Thank you for the very much open, kind introduction. Esteemed Dr. Ramanandi, dear fellow panelists, dear audience, good evening. My sole qualifications for being on this panel in such distinguished company are actually that A, I'm currently also conducting dissertation research in Dhanusha myself, and B, that I have read Richard Burghart's book. If in the following I offer criticism as well as praise of the book, then this is not to judge with the benefit of hindsight, but to examine which aspects of Burghart's dissertation may still be useful for scholars in Nepal today. The most striking aspect of Burghart's book is the wealth of empirical material that he brings to bear in order to make his theoretical arguments. His detailed accounts of the founding of the town of Janakpur in the late 18th century by Ramananda ascetics, their changing relationship first with the Shah and Rana dynasties, and finally the Panchayat regime, and the emergence of markets and land in Janakpur, form a valuable and lasting contribution to the scholarship of Nepal, and the Tarai in particular. However, it has now been 38 years since Burghart wrote the History of Janakpurdham, so I think it is fair to also examine it as a historical document itself. So where does this book fit within the broader development of anthropology as an academic discipline? The 1970s and 1980s were a period during which the relationship between anthropology and history was being redefined. Anthropology was starting to come to terms with its Orientalist baggage and used history to explore how colonial practice had shaped the objects of anthropology's inquiry, and how colonial lenses had also shaped anthropology's own modes of inquiry. In light of this, the history of Janakpurdham seems to have been simultaneously cutting edge and stuck in a dead end. It was innovative in its use of sectarian texts, historical state document, and oral history to document the impact of colonial power to the south and a changing political economy. This foreshadowed by more than a decade Nicholas Dirk's famous ethnohistory of a little kingdom in southern India, the Hollow Crown. But there are also crucial differences between Burghart's work and that of the Chicago School of Ethnohistory, out of which Dirk's work emerged. Burghart pays close attention to the intrusion of structural factors, but not to the circulation of ideas and not to the ruptures that South Asian intellectual traditions had undergone during colonialism. The latter, of course, a key concern of the Chicago School. So from a later point of view, the key problem of the history of Janakpurdham is a lack of attention to how the object of Burghart's study, the Hindu Polity, had been constructed as a field of inquiry. Burghart bases his readings of the traditional, as he calls it, Hindu Polity of the late 18th century, on late 18th century texts by contemporary ascetics and ancient Hindu texts such as the Manusmriti, which the Shah dynasty explicitly referred to. The result of this was a then very innovative interpretation in which the theoretically incompatible claims of superiority by Brahman ascetic and Hindu king, respectively, were rendered compatible through avoidance, but also carried the seeds for constant and dynamic contestation. In his book or dissertation, we then learn how this particular cultural world and its cultural categories are slowly but dramatically being transformed in their interaction with administrative and economic change. The problem here is that Burghart rarely consults what his informants themselves say or write about how they experience this process. Indeed, there are several fascinating vignettes in which Burghart presents, in which we encounter ascetics who seem to be not the least bothered by the supposed contradiction between their self-conceptualization as rulers of their own kingdoms of the mind and their tenurial relations with the Nepali state. In other words, while Burghart shows the changes that the emergence of centralized state authority in Nepal brought about, can we be quite sure about the kind of social world that was being transformed? To what extent were both Burghart's assumptions about a pre-modern Hindu polity and those of his informants colored by late 19th century and early 20th century concerns? To name one example, Burghart does not explore the role that the kingdom of Darbhanga continued to play in the Mithila political imagination even at the time of his research. Darbhanga is situated right across the border from Janakpur in northern Bihar, and Burghart does note that it had a key role in establishing the city in the late 18th century. The penultimate king of Darbhanga, like other princes of other kings of princely states during the early 20th century, had been a key supporter of the then emerging Hindutva movement. He was in fact a major financial donor of it. Ideas of Hindutva were a prominent part of the Indian debates about colonial modernity that were then ongoing. But also in areas right across the open border, a broad range of other ideas and ideologies were at play. There was a significant Congress influence, obviously, as well as explicitly class-based mobilization, broadly influential with smallholders and landless populations. All of these ideas and debates had things to say on notions of a Hindu polity. That none of them would have made their mark in early to mid-20th century Janakpur seems somewhat unlikely. So while key analytical perspectives of Burghart's dissertation thus seem rather dated today, I think he still offers very valuable guidance to historians and anthropologists studying Nepal today. For any student of contemporary Janakpur, Burghart provides an invaluable empirical baseline that touches on several of the most salient social dynamics in the city today. Janakpur is still a place with an extraordinary and fascinating public religious life. Questions of land tenancy linked to temple trusts remain nearly as tricky, problematic, and interesting now as they were then. Burghart's chapter on the establishment of monasteries and temples, sponsored by caste organizations, provides fascinating historical background to the role that caste organizations play in the politics of Janakpur and Dhanusha district today. But Burghart's work also offers important lessons beyond the history and anthropology of the Tarai. He studies political economy through fine-grained local histories of administrative change, how it structured the expansion of markets and shaped other distributive practices, and what the resulting changes meant to the people affected by them. This bears important pointers for our engagement with the political and economic transformations Nepal's population is currently experiencing, including those to do with mass migration and about which we've heard a lot over the course of this conference of the last days. To conclude, it's a really exciting prospect that Burghart's thesis will now be available more easily in Nepal. Many older intellectuals in Janakpur knew Burghart very well and interacted with him extensively at the time of his research, both in the 1970s and in the 1980s. I'm very curious to hear what they will have to say about this book, about their own town, the historiography of which many of them are very invested in. But I also think that this book will find resonance with Janakpur's younger generation. The town is currently witnessing a resurgence of interest in its own history, which accompanies numerous popular initiatives to preserve and upgrade Janakpur's public and religious infrastructure. So my hope is that Burghart's book can be appreciated as a historiographical text, but also that it can be appreciated critically as a historical document that shows how perspectives that are still very much influential today in how Western academia understands Nepal were produced in the 1970s. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Professor Yadav, we started without you. I apologize for that. But I just want to go slightly off text here to make a point. I was at a panel a few weeks ago, invited to join a panel of 4 people, and I started my remarks by saying that I thought I was being part of a panel, but instead I'm part of a manel, a term I learned from the writer Manjushri Thapa. It was easy to criticize the organizer. Unfortunately, when one organizes a panel of oneself, we end up with a manel too. Having said that, I'd like to invite Professor Ramanandi, who is known for various things. His last official position was the Vice Chancellor of Purvanchal University. He's also he's the 4th person to have read the book in its form, after Martin, Jacob, myself. He's the 4th person, and he did it in the 2 weeks since he got a copy of the book. Professor Yadav.
Honorable First President of Nepal, I might add Federal Republic of Nepal, Dr. Ramanandi Yadav, organizers of the book release ceremony, distinguished speakers, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored and humbled to be chosen to speak this afternoon by way of introducing Richard Burghart's latest and most notably the first full-length book of his own, The History of Janakpurdham, a study of asceticism and the Hindu polity, published posthumously in 2016 by Social Science Baha and Himal Books, to an audience constituted of eminent scholars and elites of the Nepal of today, and graced by none other than the first president of Nepal. I thank Deepak Thapaji for bestowing upon me the honor. I owe a personal debt to Michael Hutt, who had very graciously accepted the invitation of the British Council London to play a host to me and assist me in my consultative meetings with some eminent professors at the SOAS, University of London, during my brief sojourn as a British Council visitor in the January of 1989, when I was on my way to the United States of America as a senior Fulbright visiting scholar to carry out the rather last-minute research on my book that was later published by Mouton de Gruyter, Berlin and New York in 1996 under the title of A Reference Grammar of Maithili. Not only did Michael Hutt refer Richard Burghart's name to me, although by then I happened to have gone through his classic paper on the disappearance and reappearance of Janakpur that had come out in Kailash, a journal of Himalayan studies in 1978 in Kathmandu. He was gracious enough to provide me with his mailing address at the Süd ASEAN Institute in Heidelberg, as well as forwarded to him my forthcoming address at the Christian Albrechts Universität in Kiel, where I was scheduled to spend a term of 6 months as an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral senior research fellow during the latter half of 1989. Michael Hutt very kindly did other personal favors to me too. He sent me airmail the photocopy of a rather hard to get, all British PhD theses are rather hard to get, University of Essex 1984 PhD thesis at my University of Kentucky Lexington address in the USA at the departmental cost. I take the occasion to express my deepest gratitude to Michael Hutt. Richard Burghart and I met at the Zutiasian Institute in Heidelberg at his behest and as his family guest during July in 1989. We sort of liked each other immediately, and I even concurred to develop a joint research project, a research proposal to the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, which is simply German Research Council, in Bonn, in order to prepare a comprehensive Maithili English dictionary, a topic rather dear to his heart. I recall having discussed a host of issues relating to the state of research on South Asian languages and linguistics over home-cooked meals at his residence, while his dear wife played with the young daughter with a tender and beatific smile and even shared with me her views, rather her considered views, on the benefits of oil massages. Hold on. Oil, what is this line? The light's not sufficient. Yes, benefits of oil massages that are customarily and regularly administered to young babies in South Asian countries, including Nepal. She had indeed published a number of scientific papers on this topic in journals of psychology. At any rate, the research grant was duly granted, and upon return to Nepal, I sent copies of all the Maithili dictionaries in existence, and luckily all in my possession, to him. As a matter of fact, all existing entries were typed out and stored in a computer with the Devanagari font, not a mean achievement then. And I even managed to edit a number of samples, if I use British pronunciation, a number of samples of lexical entries, as well as train a German female student in the art and science of linguistic fieldwork in the hot plains of Nepal. All this was accomplished while I was still residing in the Tribhuvan University 34K professor's quarters at Kirtipur. Ever since I received the shocking and sad news of his sudden and tragic death at the age of 50 in 1994, he was diagnosed to have developed an advanced stage of a brain tumor. I never asked anyone anything about him, much less about the ill-fated Maithili Dictionary project. I could not muster the courage to reply to his wife's handwritten letter either. Somebody can help me? It was a sheer irony of circumstances that our roads didn't cross in Nepal, for the simple reason that at around the time when Richard Burghart was preparing to travel to South Asia, including Nepal, to conduct his ethnographic and/or ethnohistorical fieldwork in Janakpur, I was making plans to depart for the United States of America in order to pursue my doctoral level study in theoretical linguistics as a Fulbright Hedge scholar. Richard Burghart left London in 1973, while I left Kathmandu in 1974. Similarly, he received his doctorate in 1978, while I received mine in 1979. Excuse me. It was during the late afternoon of the 4th of July 2016 that a courier of the Social Science Baha delivered a sealed envelope containing a forbidding-looking consignment to me at my Lalitpur residence. Little did I know then what I was in for, that the hardcover voluminous book of 519 pages contained a total of 5 sections and 18 chapters, and that I was obliged to go through the huge work in around 3 weeks' time. I must confess that I have succeeded in barely going through the book once, much less cogitate on and analyze the main contents of the book. I therefore not wish to portray a chapter-wide summary of all the issues raised in this magnum opus of Richard Burghart's. Thankfully, Martin Gensler has done a wonderful job at that, and I commend his laudable endeavor most highly. I would be precise in critiquing the book and hope to present my views in a nutshell. Richard Burghart's book portrays an exhaustive account of the travails of the travel of a few Hindu ascetics, say from West India, garbing them under the cloak of the appellation Ramanandi to a legendary location in the present-day Nepal, now famously known as Janakpurdham, where they built huts of bamboo wattle plastered with mud and covered with thatch. These are Richard Burghart's words. And later brick-built monasteries to worship Rama and Sita. The so-called discovery, quote-unquote, of Janakpurdham was accomplished during the early 18th century. Richard Burghart conjures up the image of a world where caste and race had begun taking center stage. The king, in collusion with the sycophant Brahmin priest, who was constantly at hand to either cite a Sanskrit sloka from the Manusmriti or concoct one for the expedient moment, was described as having been wedded to the earth, thereby declaring himself as the husband to the earth. The king thus ipso facto proclaimed himself to be the unassailable owner of all land mass in his territory. We come to learn of 3 categories of land. A, the Kusbirta land granted as alms to abbots of Janakpurdham monasteries by the king in order to propitiate his gods and goddesses and to earn merit. Clearly, these abbots were exempted from the payment of revenue. B, the crown land, so-called crown land, granted by the king to Birtavals, who were his king, high-ranking officials, and occasionally Brahmin priests. And finally, C, the jungle land, newly cleared and rendered arable with the assistance of quote-unquote invited labor from the nearby East India Company territory, distributed to Bhumihar Brahmin and Rajput Zimidars and to whoever promising to pay the appropriate land revenue. Encompassing a period of 250 years, i.e. during 1700 to 1951, I have deliberately refrained from dwelling on the 1951-75 period. We all know about the Panchayat polity very well. The book, in essence, reconstructs the history, nay, odyssey, of how the Ramanandi, Vaishnavite Hindu ascetics of Janakpurdham received Kushbirta land grants from the same kings of Makwanpur. Janakpur was then not under the king of Nepal, it was under the same king of Makwanpur. The Shaha kings of Gorkha, later the Rana prime ministers of Kathmandu, and finally one Shah king of Nepal, as well as of how the crown land was granted to Virdwals and the jungle land, as I said earlier, rendered arable to the person who expressed willingness to pay the revenue. As a matter of fact, Janakpurdham is a microcosm of the entire land mass of the Tarai, now called the Madhesh. Janakpurdham metamorphoses into a symbol, an icon, and an epitome of the oppression and exploitation that the Madhesis have suffered ever since. I was sickened to death having to go through pages after pages, a rather bizarre account of the manipulative and conniving ploys devised by the rulers and their subordinates merely to extract more and yet more revenue collections under one pretext or the other from the subjects of Janakpurdham of the Mahottari district in the eastern Tarai. That is what he always describes Janakpur. Janakpur was indeed in Mahottari district then, and my citizenship was from Mahottari to begin with. Throughout the text, we rarely come across any description of the peoples who inhabited the land mass of the Tarai and as to how they fared and survived. Thanks to Richard Burghart, the bizarre and rather brazen account may lend credence and even corroborate the by now common claim that the rulers of Nepal have perennially viewed the land mass called Tarai, read Madhesh, as a potent and lucrative source of mere revenue collection, and that they paid but scant attention to the growth and prosperity and welfare of the peoples, read Madhesi, that have inhabited the area ever since. The rulers paid but little heed to the Manusmriti Sloka that warned them of Narkabasa. Maheshchandra Regmi translates that as sink into hell if they failed to perform as a Prajapalaka. The Brahmin priests did not remind them of their duty either. Richard Burghart, as a fastidious raconteur, as it were, tells us a story in this book. A rather long and protracted story of a number of extraordinary Ramanandi Vaishnavite Hindu ascetics. His narrative technique is characterized by systematic inquiry, steely accuracy, cool and invincible logic, and incisive and rather indisputable epigraphic and archival evidence, leaning occasionally rather too heavily on Maheshchandra Regmi's shoulders. It's an added pleasure to have as a bonus, as it were, the translated versions rendered by Richard Burghart himself of the genealogies of the same dynasty of Makabantu, the Shaha dynasty of Gorkha, the Rana lineage, formerly Kunwar of Nepal, the spiritual genealogy of the Matihani monastery, along with a host of royal land grant documents addressed to the abbots of the numerous monasteries and hermitages of the Janakpurdham and the vicinity in the appendix. I wish the original versions were printed too, in spite of having added to the bulk of the book. The book is already bulky, you know that. That would make a great linguistic study of the language used in administration of the time, although I have personal knowledge of the fact that most Syaha Mohar and Lal Mohar Chithi Patra of the time used the language of the vanquished and not of the victor. I draw your attention to Shankar Maharaj Vansi's Pura Tattva Patra Sangraha, Volume 2, published by the HNG Department of Archaeology and Culture in 1961. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't the first time that I have come across an occasion to go through a University of London PhD thesis. Let me amuse you with a couple of instances. One 1950 thesis by B.N. Prasad of the University of Patna on a palatographic study of Bhojpuri sound segments came all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, dearly insured and heavily guarded, and sent in my name to the library of the University of Kansas Lawrence, USA, by none other than Professor Robbins, the head of the Department of Linguistics. Obviously, they would definitely recall the name of Professor Robbins. I had to sign a written document stating that I shall only read the thesis in the presence of a deputed university librarian or photocopy portions of the thesis. To my utter delight and surprise, I discovered that I happened to be the 8th reader of the thesis in the world. God save the University of London PhD thesis. Another one was a microfiche of the 1933 PhD thesis by S.K. Jha, again of the University of Patna, dealing with an edition of a Maithili manuscript, the Padavali of Govinda Dasa. What struck me most was that a number of pages bore fountain pen writings over and above the typed lines by way of correction by none other than Sir Ralph Turner in the already submitted and accepted version of the thesis. At that time, SOAS was only, was African, was not added. So it was School of Oriental Studies. But what irked me most about the present 1978 thesis-turned book was the gross disregard to the internationally agreed upon conventions to faithfully represent the Devanagari words of Sanskrit or Hindi or Perso-Arabic, read Urdu origin in the Roman alphabet. Without meaning to nitpick and draw your attention to the aberrations and anomalies that abound in the text, I point out only a couple of cases that are a real eyesore to me. For example, this was a blackboard or something, or whiteboard, but anyway, I'll manage without it. The word samskara is represented as, and I give you the spelling, how it is done, S-A-N with a vertical bar on N, S-K-A with a vertical bar on A, and R-A. Page 5, as I said, with a vertical bar on the consonant letter N to denote anuswar. While the word sringar is represented as, and I again read out, S with a slanted stress mark. I don't know what it is for. Maybe that's to represent Shah. R, and then I with a vertical bar, and then N with a vertical bar, and G and A with a vertical bar, and R. That's on page 58. Again with a vertical bar on the consonant letter N to denote anuswara and or the velar nasal consonant ng, and with the absence of the final letter A. Needless to say, no such symbol denoting a consonant letter with a vertical bar on it exists in Indological and or linguistic studies. I'm amazed that all this escaped the sharp and penetrating attention of the University of London PhD thesis supervisor, of whom sadly no mention is made, or of Martin Gensley, who holds a copyright to the very ably written editorial introduction to the book. My assertion is that the marvel and the quality of this otherwise highly ingenious and seminal research work of Richard Burghart is woefully marred by an overriding presence of such minor aberrations and anomalies throughout in the text. Ladies and gentlemen, I hold Richard Burghart in high esteem. His 1984 paper titled The Formation of the Concept of Nation-State in Nepal, that came out in Journal of Asian Studies, has turned out to be one of the most quoted works in the sociological and anthropological literature in India and Nepal. Another insightful study that I have read with profit and made extensive references to it in my studies of the sociology of the Maithili speech is titled A Quarrel in the Language Family, meaning Maithili language family, and republished in the well-known book, The Conditions of Listening, Essays on Religion, History and Politics in South Asia, that was later edited by Fuller and Spencer and published in Delhi by the Oxford University Press in 1996. Thus, for the singular contributions to the study of Mithila, Madhesh and Maithili, Richard Burghart may sit comfortably in the august company of Upendra Thakur, who is world famous for his scholarly work titled History of Mithila, published as early as 1956 by the Mithila Institute, Darbhanga. Paul Brass, who is well known for his 1974 work, Language, Religion and Politics in North India, published in Cambridge by the Cambridge University Press, and Frederick H. Gage, who is immortalized by his 1975 monumental work titled Regionalism and National Unity in Nepal, published in Berkeley and Los Angeles by the University of California Press. And thankfully, Deepak Thapaji, Social Science Baha, have put out a reprint of that book, and he was very kind enough to give me a gift copy of the book a couple of years ago. I thank him once again. Social Science Baha and Himal Books have done us proud by publishing this rare gem of a scholarly work. As a resident of Janakpur, my joys know no bounds. But I have a secret to share this afternoon. There is in existence a draft manuscript of yet another book that Richard Burghart would have wanted to publish. This relates to a socio-linguistic analysis of the colloquial variety of the Maithili language, for which he had most likely carried out extensive research and collected a substantial body of data through field work in the Maithili-speaking area of Nepal and probably India. He had indeed asked me to check the veracity of the Maithili data, but I never got inkling into his mode of analysis. The manuscript is tentatively titled Introduction to Spoken Maithili in Social Contexts, parts 1 through 3. And apparently it is stored in the Universität Heidelberg Südasien Institute, Abteilung für Ethnologie, which means Department of Ethnology. And if I'm not mistaken, a copy of the draft also lies in the midst of archival materials stored in the library of the University of Leipzig in Germany. I would rather that Deepak Thapaji, and he's at my back so I can't point out to him, I would rather that Deepak Thapaji unearth the material and cause it to see the light of the day in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yadav, for that very personal touch that you brought to this proceedings. I would just like to clarify the points that you raised regarding the diacritics used in the book. One of the things that Martin and I were very clear from the very beginning is that we don't want to touch anything. It's going to be faithfully presented as Burghart had typed it up with all the diacritics. And the examples that you gave exactly, Samskara and Shringa, were the ones we had the greatest difficulty in finding the correct symbols, because they don't exist. So one had to create them. So that was indeed a problem, and that had been recognized by Martin. I'm not a linguist, so I don't know these things. But we did, or at least Martin did, and we had agreed that nothing would be changed because it's not in our, it's not up to us, for a man who's been long dead. We should not tamper with his text. But having said that, thank you once again. Now the formal part, I would like to request Dr. Rambaran Yadav to unveil the book and Martin, please. Thank you, Dr. Yadav. Now I would like to request you to please provide your remarks.
यो सभामा उपस्थित महिला एवं सज्जनवृन्द र यो विद्वान मण्डलीमा उपस्थित हुँदा मलाई खुसी लागेको छ। सबभन्दा खुसी कि पशुपा विद्वानले जनकपुरको बारेमा जहाँ मैले त्यहाँ 5-7 माइल नर्थमा मेरो जन्म भएको थियो र मैले प्राइमेरी एजुकेसन त्यहीँबाट स्टार्ट गरेर यहाँसम्म देशको राष्ट्राध्यक्ष भए। त्यसले गर्दा जनकपुरको बारेमा जुन किताब हिस्ट्री अफ जनकपुर धामको बारेमा जुन विद्वानहरूले अहिले प्रकाश पार्नु भएको छ त्यसमा मैले धेरै केही कन्ट्रिब्युट गर्न सक्दिनँ र मैले फर्मेलिटीको लागि तपाईहरुको बीचमा खुशी व्यक्त गर्दै दुई शब्द भन्न चाहन्छु। First of all, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me to this unique event and for allowing me the privilege to release a book that is of such great significance to the part of Nepal I came from. We have heard from Professor Michael Hutt about Richard Burghart and from my old friend Professor Ramanandi about this book itself. The young scholar Jacob Ring has provided the context in which to understand the book in today's world. I have to admit that until recently, Richard Burghart was not a name familiar to me. He conducted research in Janakpur, very close to my birthplace, and where I later came to practice medicine there, and also in early age to study the primary education up to the school. And yet I did not know him. That means Richard Burghart that time. But I had the bird's eye view of this book, The History of Janakpurdham, a study of asceticism and the Hindu Polity. I have come to learn a part of history of my area that I had only heard about the stories and tales from my elders. To read about it in such a great detail, about the various cross currents between the state and society that ultimately shaped the place Janakpur turned out to be over time was a fascinating journey for me. अब यो किताबको बारेमा जुन तीनवटा विद्वानले प्रकाश पार्नु भएको छ त्यो मलाई लाग्छ हामीलाई अझ इन्ट्रेस्ट जगाउनु भएको छ यो बुकलाई जो मैले रिलिज गरेको छु यसलाई स्टडी गर्न. The speakers before me have highlighted why the book is such a great scholarly contribution on Nepal, and also how it relates to a very important part of the country. Not being an academic myself, I will not devolve into these matters since there are many more competent people in this gathering who can do a much better job than I can. What I will say that Richard Burghart book is all the more important since he was conducting research in the Tarai at a time when most of the research were focused on learning about the people in the hills and the mountain of Nepal. He proved to be one of the few exceptions who went to the Tarai with all the difficulties starting with the heat and managed to bring to light an almost forgotten chapter of the Janakpur rich past. This is only because Janakpur is believed to be birthplace of Sita. This is only because Janakpur is believed to be the birthplace of Sita, but also because it is the capital of cultural entity of Mithila. It is a great pity that it took almost about 38 years for the book to see the light of day since Burghart completed work on the dissertation. I have to commend and congratulate and thank the editor of the book, Professor Martin Gensley of the University of Vienna, for taking the trouble to resurrect the dissertation and bring it to life in this form. Professor Martin Gensley is not here, but I would like to ask the organizer to relay the message to him that he has managed to revive a unique scholarly contribution and one that will not be forgotten in Nepal. Congratulations are also due to Social Science Baha and Himalaya for taking the initiative to publish this book, for organizing the event today so that we can all celebrate the unique individual that Richard Burghart was. उहाँलाई फेरि एकचोटि म हृदयदेखि धन्यवाद दिँदै र प्रोफेसर Michael Hart, Jacob Ring, and my well friend Dr. Ramanandi Yadav, यहाँ धेरै विद्वानहरू तपाईहरुको बीचमा यो किताब आज रिलिज गरेको छु जनकपुरको बारेमा धेरै खुसी लागेको छ यो इभिनिङमा र तपाईहरुलाई सबैलाई धन्यवाद दिँदै बिदा हुन्छु धन्यवाद
Thank you, Dr. Yadav, for your kind and very encouraging words. We're coming to the close of the event today. I'd like to thank the panel for sharing your thoughts with the audience, and for all of you for being here in what I think is a major event for Nepali scholarship. With this, I'd like to invite you all to join us for tea in the room behind us. And thank you once again.